Yes, should be able to repeat it. Yeah, that should be. Now, here's all the thing. You gotta click on the screen. Okay, now you do it. Is that where you want it?
200-foot drop.
Still not working?
No, it's not it. Hey, while he's working on this screen, we can't move it. Just tell us if you want to move it, we'll move it. Still not working? Have you got it done? Oh, he got a new device.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to dive into a character study of King Solomon tonight. And certainly need your help in some of the things that I found interesting, and hopefully what you found interesting. We'll have a good discussion. As we begin this study, Solomon represents what in the line of kings to you? What does Solomon represent? Is he like the best king there ever was? Is he the fulfillment of a promise that God made to David? Yes, surely. Was he the wisest king among the whole bunch?
He started off with a really bad heart. He started off following God, and God was impressed that he loved God so much and he walked in God's ways, and God gave him the wish, which was wisdom. So he started off with good even before the wisdom.
Okay. We'll look at that tonight. Obviously, his prayer, petitioning God for wisdom. I asked, one of the questions I gave you was, did God fulfill that? That's kind of a tongue-in-cheek question. Obviously, God did give him the wisdom. But what strikes me is, as what Anita was alluding to, he didn't fulfill the potential at all. And why is the question that pops into my mind. Why? God gave him blessings in the form of miraculous wisdom, and then notoriety, popularity, wealth. And he let all that go to waste for some reason. It's an interesting thought for me, maybe for you. We'll talk about it. But as we enter this study of the kings, and we're in the United Kingdom right now. Solomon is the last king of the United Kingdom, which would be what? 3 kings would be in the United Kingdom. Saul, David, and Solomon. In the book of 1 Kings, it starts off with a really interesting description of David. It calls him old, advanced in age, and could not keep warm. And then it goes into the discussion of how they found the most beautiful virgin in the land, Abishag, to come and basically cuddle the old man to keep him warm. What is that story all about? How does that fit into what God wants his readers to think about? Do you see anything in there that's maybe the story behind the story?
That he was human.
He was human? Okay. In what way? That he
had all the infirmities that old people get.
Okay.
One thing I read, Tommy referenced that he possibly had hypothermia, is why he couldn't stay warm.
Okay. All right. So we have Stuart.
I think all the way up through the point that we've been reading, there's no indication that tells you to become a frail man. I mean, he was a warrior, out about. And he got a little bit of a hint about not going out there without someone, not fighting, and then there's another deal where he only battle, got killed in another battle later. But here, the point seems to be that David has gone quite frail. It seems to be quite frail.
And frail in what ways can you suppose? Not just that he can't keep warm, but maybe what? Maybe he's slipped a little bit in his mental capacity? It's interesting that when Nathan comes to Bathsheba and says, hey, did you know about Adonisja and what he's doing? And she said, basically, no. And then Nathan comes up with the plan. Where does Bathsheba go to entreat David? Where is David? On the throne? In the throne room? No. In verse 15, it says he's in his bedroom. He's huddling in his bedroom. Not huddling is a commentary. He's in his bedroom, and Bathsheba goes in there to entreat him as to, hey, didn't you tell me that my son Solomon was going to be the next king? So I am reading a little bit into the story here. I see an old man who has retreated from the duties of governing to some degree and has, because of his age, his advanced age, has kind of withdrawn a little bit. So let's get into some of the other questions. What is happening basically behind his back, behind David's back? Adonijah has decided to do what? To claim the throne. Now, why would he do that? A couple of questions I had for you. Why would he do that? What would cause him to feel entitled? And two, did he not know that Solomon had been chosen by God? Did he not know? Did everybody not know?
Well, it says he was born next after Absalom. So was Absalom the firstborn? And so he would assume he would be next in line? He was the fourth one. But I don't know if all three had the one.
He's the last living oldest son, yes. Amnon was killed, Absalom was killed, and there was another one in there called Chileab or something that disappears. And everybody, all of the scholars think he probably died somewhere along the way, maybe at a young age. But at this moment, Adonijah is the heir apparent based on birth order. There's a couple other things that it says in verse 6. His father had never crossed him at any time by asking, why have you done so? And he was a very handsome man. And he was born after Absalom. There was three things that the writer of the book says. He'd never been told no. He was spoiled rotten. He had all his life been treated as a very handsome man, and you know how that goes with people. They get a lot of extras, benefits from that. And he was the oldest son left. So, David's still living. Adonijah builds a power base, gathers some people around him. Who did he gather?
Joab,
Who's the other one?
priest.
Abiathar the priest. And he goes down to a spring, which is interesting. He goes to a spring and basically announces himself king. And, they're down there feasting and celebrating. And Nathan the prophet hears about it, develops this plan with Bathsheba to go in and let David know about it. David, who is the king, is in his bedroom. An old advanced man who can't keep warm is in his bedroom, and they go in and tell him the story. Did you know that Adonijah has declared himself king? Bathsheba goes in first. This is the plan that Nathan has developed. Then Nathan comes in as soon as she finishes her story, her monologue, and he comes in and confirms everything that she said. And so we are in a picture here of basically a coup, of kind of like what Absalom did. Stuart?
You had asked earlier, I think you had asked if Adonisja knew that Solomon was supposed to be king. I think that scripture indicates, yeah, he did know. When you go look at verse 10, Adonisja is sacrificing sheep offering and fatted cow, invited all the royal brothers and all the men of Judah and the servants of the king. But look who he didn't invite. He did not invite Nathan the prophet, Benaiah, the warrior, or his brother Solomon. Now, why would he purposely leave out somebody unless he knew?
Part of the group he invited were the king's sons, and he did not bring Solomon into that group for some reason. So there was some indication there, yeah. Any other thoughts?
It kind of seems like a Jacob and Joseph kind of a situation, possibly, where Joseph was not the oldest, not the firstborn, but he was the most beloved and was, destined to be the leader of kind of the thing. Maybe it seems like that same thing where Adonisja feels, I'm the oldest. I'm the oldest and still alive, and so it's my right to be king. So I'm going to do that. Even though I know Dad likes Solomon over the most, and he's probably going to give him the throne. He's old, and he's crazy, so I'm going to do it.
I think you're right. It's a power struggle that he has set up here, and he's gotten Joab on his side and Abiathar the priest, and those are two very powerful power centers, the military and the priesthood, at least one of the priests behind him, supporting his claim. And so, looks good until David, hearing that he had made this claim, David does what? To put an absolute stamp of non-approval on Adonijah. David does what? Mule. And that's important. A mule. What else?
Sends him to the same town.
Sends him to a spring there in Jerusalem, the Gihon spring. Something about springs, because when Adonijah wanted to claim kingship, he went to a spring. Now, David says, take him down to the spring Gihon and put him on my mule and parade him through the streets, bring him back to wherever the throne was and set him on the throne, and I will announce him king. And you just really, those things, riding the king's mule was the signal that this man was the next king. He's riding on David's mule. Plus, he's being accompanied by Zadok the priest and Benaniah. Who was Benaniah? What was his position? Yes, but a very special warrior. He was the leader of the king's guard, the Cherethites and the Pelethites, the basic bodyguards of the king. They were part of the procession. Benaniah is leading them, and so there's a strong. And when the city sees it, when the city of Jerusalem, the people see it, they're proclaiming him, long live the king, or whatever it is. And so what David has done is completely cut the legs out from underneath Adonijah. So, what is Adonijah's response to that? He runs, he flees to, it's interesting, he flees to the altar and grabs a hold of the horns. What does that mean?
Safety.
Safety?
He could be killed by the ones that don't almost do.
Yeah, it's a place of asylum. He's claiming he's claiming asylum. You can't touch me as long as I'm holding onto the horns of the altar. Is that true, or is it just custom?
I think they proved
Based on what Joab does, right? Joab later does the same thing, and Benaniah goes back to David and says, I can't touch him. He's got a hold of the horns of the altar. And David says, no.
I thought that was also kind of removed after verse.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes, it is absolutely. I kind of jumped over a point I really wanted to make. We see this picture here of Adonisja kind of rebelling, claiming that he's the king, instituting a coup, and David having to go through all these machinations in order to establish Solomon as his choice, as David's choice, as David's successor. But over in Chronicles, in chapters 28 and 29, the story over there, I hope you all read it, is that David assembled at Jerusalem all the officials of Israel, the princes of the tribes, the commanders of the divisions, the commanders of thousands. He brought in everybody of any consequence, and he rose to his feet and said, "Listen to me, brethren, and my people. I had intended to build a permanent home for the ark, but God won't let me, and so I'm giving that task to my son Solomon." Verse 5, "Of all my sons the Lord has given me, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, your son Solomon is the one who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be a son to me, and I will be a father to him. I will establish his kingdom forever if he resolutely performs my commandments and my ordinances, as is done now." So there's this very public ceremony naming Solomon as his successor. David is standing in front of all these people saying this, saying, God has given me the command to pick this man, and this man Solomon, and now he is commissioned to be the next king and to build the house that God wants. How do you reconcile those two pictures of 1 Kings and Adonijah and David doing this stuff for Solomon so that the people would know he was? Can you reconcile? Milton?
Even in 1 Chronicles, we were told that was the second time he was set on the throne. And so it sounds to me like the first time that y'all have discussed was a pragmatic sort of, on the spur of the moment, enthronement that a few people knew, but it wasn't this huge assembly that you have for the second one. And the second one was even more than a one-day event. On the second day, they had this enormous sacrifice, 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, 1,000 lambs. That one took a lot of preparation, and was obviously one that the masses knew about. That's what I would call a formal enthronement, as opposed to this pragmatic, practical reason to get him on the throne in a hurry that we have over in 1 Kings.
Good. So Milton's referencing especially verse 22 of chapter 29. "And they made Solomon, son of David, king a second time, and they anointed him as a ruler for the Lord, and Zadok as priest." Okay. So, so we have this picture that of Adonijah trying to claim the throne and being outfoxed by what David does. And so he recognizes that he is now basically an outcast, not an outcast, but he's a rebel, considered a rebel now. He's considered someone who's attempted a coup and failed. So he flees to the altar, grabs hold of the horns, and begs for mercy and claims asylum. And what does Solomon do to Adonijah? What's his response to his claim for asylum? He shows mercy. In what way?
He said, as long as he's doing what's right, he won't die. Not a thing will ever his head will fall. But if he's evil,
and he tells him to go to your house. It's almost as if he's banished or exiled. Obviously, he's not going to be part of the new royal court, but he tells him, go to your house. It almost looks to me like he says, go to your house and stay there, buddy. And jumping ahead a little bit, over in chapter 3, latter part of chapter 2, Adonijah does something really stupid. But he goes to Bathsheba and says, do me a favor. Just whatever I ask, don't refuse me. She says, what do you want? And he asked for Abishag, the Shunammite, who used to be David's what? Wasn't David's concubine. He was David's nurse, but maybe a little more than that. And for some reason, Bathsheba finds that entreaty to be reasonable. So she goes to Solomon and says in verse 20 of chapter 2, I am making one small request of you. Do not refuse me. And he says, ask my mother, for I will not refuse you. Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah your brother as a wife. And Solomon answered and said to her, and why are you asking Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my older brother. And even for him, for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah. And I probably didn't say that correctly. It was more like, ask for the kingdom too then. That's more what he said, right? What's going on there?
The same thing Absalom tried to do, right? Is take all of David's concubines and wives and show a sign of authority by having the old king's wives, conquer them, supposedly, take it for himself to show he's in charge. And so this is kind of an underhanded way of, I'm already the oldest, I've already got the king's captain of the guard, and I want the priest on my side, and then if I can get Abishag, then I've kind of got the whole thing, and all the people will see me as the king. So it's kind of an undercutting way to sneak in one last go at it, I think.
Okay, I do too. I think he's intending another run at the throne. But for some reason, Bathsheba didn't see that, or I don't know. I don't know what her thinking was. But it's just an interesting thought. Stuart? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to your hand. No. Anybody else?
But it's possible that she knew what was the reaction was going to be if she just beat.
Oh, really?
I mean, it's just directly possible.
Yeah?
She could.
So she was thinking in her mind, oh, okay, yeah, that'll fix you up. Okay. All right.
Tommy,
Yes, sir.
there's another answer to your question about why the story of David and Abishai. Abishai, it really is the story of both of them, because Abishai comes back into the picture and has a part of the story of what happens to the unhappy brother.
I see. So part of the old man advanced in age can't get warm, part of that story being Abishag, the foot warmer.
She's described as very beautiful.
Yeah. Okay, good. And so what was the result of his request for Abishag? What happened to him? Obviously, Solomon said, you've gone one step too far, fella, and he puts him to death. And it's interesting that in the text, immediately after that, he goes to Abiathar the priest and says, you deserve to die, but I will not put you to death at this time. And he banishes him. He dismissed Abiathar from being priest to the Lord in order to fulfill the word of the Lord which he had spoken concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. So I don't know if there's an inference there that Abiathar was part of this Adonijah's request. But anyway, at this particular point, David removes Abiathar as a power broker in the royal court. Well, that seems to be maybe even overstepping his authority, but he did it anyway. Yes?
Well, Abiathar was one of the ones initially in Adonijah's first rebellion. And so I think this is just a continuation of weeding out the rebelliousness.
Okay. So in that vein, let's talk about what David tells Solomon to do with Joab, Shimei, and in that context, he also references the sons of Barzillai. What is David telling him, not just specifically the details of what to do, but why is he addressing those men in particular to Solomon, who has now become king? Did I lead you to exactly what I wanted you to say or not?
Tommy, you mean to Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet?
No.
What you mean?
What I was referring to in verse chapter 2, David charges Solomon to watch out for Joab, because he's a killer. He's killed 2 very good men, Abner and Amasa. And watch out for Shimei, the guy who threw stones at me when I was fleeing Jerusalem. And he also, in that context, mentions show kindness to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite. We understand the sons of Barzillai. When David fled Jerusalem from Absalom, he ended up over in Gilead, and he ended up, what town? I don't remember what town. But anyway, it was the town of where Barzillai the Gileadite was, and he provided for David and all his staff while David was in exile. And when he came back, David invited him to come back to Jerusalem with him, and then he only went as far as the Jordan River and said, I'm too old. I'm not going any further. I'm going to go home. But if you want to do me a favor, take these sons of mine and let them eat at your table. And so there's some relatives, children of Barzillai, who are in the court, and David is exhorting Solomon to continue to give them the place of prestige that they held when David was alive. But the other 2, Joab and Shimei, David tells Solomon, don't let Joab live any longer. Do not let him go to the grave of natural causes. You put him to death. Why did he do that?
I think one thought is that David recognized that those 2 men would be kind of a threat to his kingship.
Okay.
The other thought I had is so I clean my mess up and take care of it.
Barry said David was kind of inferring, you need to clean up the mess that I made, so that I didn't ever get around to cleaning up. Referencing Joab and all of the freelancing that Joab has done, and you know, Joab has been more than the power behind the throne in many ways. He has been a decision maker in a lot of ways, forced David into some situations that he didn't really want to. Probably the most prominent one, David said, don't kill Absalom. And as soon as Joab heard Absalom was hanging in a tree, he went out and slew him immediately. But Joab's answer to just about everything was, stick him in the... So, and now he has been involved in this coup attempt by Adonisja, and David's telling Solomon, you can't trust the man, you need to do away with him. Stuart?
And it's interesting because he said, he's still a pro man. But it seems like he's got his mental faculty all the time.
David? Yeah.
That he knows exactly what to do in order to establish Solomon as king. He gives explicit instructions on what to do about certain situations. The passage you read in 1 Chronicles 20, whatever it was, about, Solomon was to be the following to the king. He was going to be one building the temple. And he said this is the second time that Solomon was crowned king. So kind of get the impression that David was able to get up to some degree at some point. Maybe it was last training that allowed him to do that. But it seems like he does mental faculty too young.
Good point. Milton, did you have a point?
Just going to say that Solomon thought that it was God's will that they be destroyed. He specifically indicates that this blood should be shed because he shed the blood, and he mentions Abner and Amasa as if that were God's repayment to Joab.
Okay, all right, good. Within that discussion, within that dialogue, it's interesting that David puts it this way: so act according to your wisdom, and do not let his gray hair go down to the Sheol in peace. And then over in verse 9, referring to Shimei this time, now therefore do not let him go unpunished, for you are a wise man. He references twice there in this discussion, use your wisdom. Has Solomon already gotten his miraculous wisdom, or is he just being complimented by his father? Anita?
I was going to comment on that. I was going to comment that he told him that he swore to the Lord that he would not kill Shimei, and which may have empowered Shimei to be rebellious, and he's saying, watch out for him. He's going to try to rebel, and he'll say.
Okay, all right. And remember the story that Solomon tells Benaiah to kill Joab. Joab flees to the altar, grabs hold of the horns of the altar, and Benaiah goes back to the king, says, what can I do? The king said to him, do as he has spoken, fall upon him and bury him, that you may remove from me and from my father's house the blood which Joab shed without cause. The Lord will return his blood on his own hand. That's what Milton was referencing. And then Shimei, of course, Solomon says, you go stay in your house, you stay within the confines of Jerusalem, never leave the city, and you'll be fine. And it tells us that Shimei, at some time later, chased a slave to Gaza, somewhere over in the Philistine area, brought him back, and as soon as he came back, someone told Solomon, hey, Shimei left the city. And so Solomon says, you brought it on yourself, and he has him killed also. These are pictures of a king, a new king, establishing his authority, building a power base, eliminating perceived problems. What do you see there? I'm sorry, Austin?
To answer your question here and before, I think he had a good amount of wisdom, seeing how he followed his father's instructions. He wasn't beguiled by smooth talking or anything. He wasn't like, well, Joab was a good commander, so I'd probably keep him on to lead some armies. No, he had the wisdom to know what to do, and he seemed to do it well because his kingdom was established. But then he also had enough wisdom to know that he didn't have enough wisdom. And I think that, I think later is when he asks for wisdom, understanding that man's wisdom is not enough.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you. So, let's go down to, why did Solomon go to get, now, after that, and somewhere along, where is this about? Well, so Solomon has established himself to some degree as the king. He's eliminated some of his enemies. He has gathered some power brokers around him, that being particularly Benaiah, Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet. So he goes at this time to Gibeon, to one of the high places, to offer sacrifices. Why did Solomon go to Gibeon to offer sacrifices on a high place? High places are what, all through 1 Kings, every king will be evaluated about how obedient he is to God's covenant, and almost always part of that evaluation is he did not remove the high places. Except for a couple, Hezekiah and Josiah, and they are commended because they did remove the high places. Why is Solomon going to a high place to offer sacrifice?
my passage of scripture said that it's the most famous high place or something like that. So, yeah, it was the most famous high place. I don't know, maybe it was just the end place to be.
Okay.
Gideon has a history anyway. You can go back to Joshua and Joshua 10, where I think it's where the sun stood while Joshua was leading an army. The sun stood still, so that Joshua, that happened to Gideon.
Okay. All right.
My guess is that there's some shrine there remembering that.
It says in verse 2 that no house has been built for the name of the Lord yet, and it sounds like in verse 1 that the entire city and the temple and the wall are all under construction. So I wonder if during the course of that construction, the tabernacle was kind of put out of use as elements were brought in or used for setting up the temple. And so this was the temporary worship spot.
Go over to 2 Chronicles, 1st chapter. Now Solomon the son of David established himself securely over his kingdom, and the Lord his God was with him and exalted him greatly. Solomon spoke to all Israel, to the commanders of thousands, of hundreds, of judges, every leader, to all Israel, the houses of the fathers, heads of the father's household. Then Solomon and all the assembly went with him to the high place which was at Gibeon, for God's tent of meeting was there. However, David had brought up the ark from Kiriath Jearim to the place he had prepared for it, for he had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. Now the bronze altar was there before the tabernacle of the Lord. So Gibeon is where the tabernacle is. And there is the bronze altar is there. So it's interesting, the history of the tabernacle. If you think about it, it was way back during the kingship of Saul that the battle with the Philistines, that they carried the Ark of the Covenant to battle with them and lost it. But also at that particular time, the place called Shiloh was overrun. And that's where the tabernacle was. And we don't really know what happened, but the tabernacle kind of lost some of its identity with the people. We know later on that David, fleeing from Saul, went to a place called Nob and said, "Give me whatever you have to eat." And what did the priest there at Nob say? "All I have is the bread from the showbread table." So apparently the ark was there. At least the showbread table of showbread was there. So it looks like the tabernacle survived the battle of Shiloh in some way, maybe incomplete way, but it wasn't destroyed. That's what I'm trying to say. Tabernacle was not destroyed, and at least some of its utensils show up at Nob later when David's fleeing. And then here we see it at Gibeon. And when Solomon finally builds the temple, it talks about how he brought all of that up from Gibeon and incorporated it into the opening of the temple. But what has happened to the Ark of the Covenant? It got lost at the Battle of Shiloh. It spent 20 years in a place of the house of what? Obed-Edom, that man. And it wasn't until David went down to get it, and he carried it a short distance, and Uzziah put his hand up, and so David stuck it in somebody else's house for a period of time until he went back and learned how he was supposed to carry it correctly. Finally, he brings it to Jerusalem and does what with it? It says he created a tent of meeting in Jerusalem for the Ark of the Covenant. So and he builds an altar in front of that tent where people sacrifice. going back to 1 Kings. So we have this picture of Solomon going to Gibeon, offering, I think it's, anyway, he offers sacrifices there. And then asks God, petitions God for wisdom. And I'm trying to figure out where I'm wanting to go. Here it is in verse 15 of chapter 3. Then after the dream and God's answer, yes, I'm going to give you wisdom because you didn't ask for power and wealth. I'm going to give you wisdom and power and wealth. And if you walk in my ways, verse 14, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David did, then I will prolong your days. Then Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream, and he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered burnt offerings, and made peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. Okay, we have the tabernacle in Gibeon with at least the altar. And then we have the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem in a tent with an altar in front of it. Solomon offers sacrifices here. Solomon offers sacrifices here. What is the state of worship of Jehovah in the nation at this time? Any thoughts? Were the people aware of the feast days? Were the people sacrificing themselves? Was any of the laws of the book of Leviticus being followed? We have two priests. We have Abiathar and Zadok. Why do we have two priests? Well, apparently it's because we have two places of worship. One of them was the priest in Gibeon, and one of them was the priest in Jerusalem. Is that the way God wanted it? What's going on here? Was David the only believer in Jehovah? No, but I don't see a whole lot of sincere followers of Jehovah at this time. These people had lost a lot in terms of knowledge and proper worship.
It's interesting because they had a chance to get the temple built before in King David's reign. Maybe because David recognized there's something back up like this. And he wanted to build a temple. And they go ahead and do it. And then he's walking out, and God said, no, he's not. Go back in and tell him he's not there. His son is going to do it. Too much blood on his hands. I think you bring up a good point. There seems to be a disconnect there. Children of Israel may not recognize what's supposed to be done. They did try to rectify that by building the temple. God said it's not time for you to do that. It's not for you to do that.
I think it's a good point.
They had the time to gather all the material for the temple.
Good. All right, that's a thought question. Okay. We talked a little bit at the beginning. Did God grant Solomon's request for wisdom? Well, it seems obvious that he did. In 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 29, now God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind like the sand that's on the seashore, etc., etc. He became very known throughout the whole world. Wise men came to him for advice. We remember the story of the dividing the baby. Next slide. We remember the story of dividing the baby incident as an example of his great wisdom. We see in chapter 4, verses 20 through 21, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sands on the seashores, abundance. They were eating and drinking, rejoicing, and Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute, served Solomon all the days of his life. That river is the Euphrates, all the way to Babylon. His kingdom, his influence at least, reached from Babylon to the Philistines on the Mediterranean coast, all the way to Egypt. He had expanded the borders to the nth degree. He was, the point being, he was politically and economically astute. He was considered the wisest man in the world by all of the other wise men. He exhibited that wisdom in his judgments as people came before him. And yet he did some things that I cannot reconcile with being wise. It says that he married the daughter of Egypt. He formed marriage alliances with other nations. Nehemiah tells us that this was his downfall over in chapter 13. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. He gathered horses and chariots. It tells us in 2 Chronicles 1, verse 14, he bought horses and chariots from Egypt. Apparently they were the arms dealers of the world, and so he built a huge military directly against what God had said in the book of Deuteronomy. Don't do that. Do not rely on your own military might. Turn to me, and I will take care of you. That doesn't look like it's a wise thing. And then in 1 Kings 5, verse 13, he conscripted from it says he conscripted 70,000 transporters, 80,000 of hewers in the mountains. Over in Chronicles, it tells us that those were aliens, people who were not Israelites. But he did called into servitude 30,000 Israelites. He was so consumed with his building projects that he went out and forced servitude upon 30,000 Israelites and 150,000 non-Israelites to build the temple and his palace and a couple of other things. And ultimately, when Rehoboam became king, those people, the leaders of those people, came to Rehoboam and said, "Your father's yoke has been harsh. Will you please lighten it?" And you remember Rehoboam said, "I'm not going to lighten it. You think that was harsh? You just wait." And because of that, the kingdom split. As we're doing a character study of King Solomon, there's some incongruities there that I can't reconcile. I just thought maybe you could think about that. If you have any thoughts, help me out.
To me, it seems his wisdom is primarily the world wisdom, not wisdom towards God.
Okay.
I mean, marrying wife after wife for political bias, that's wise from the world perspective. Build
Smart in the world, but not necessarily spiritually wise. Milton?
And yet, he was the one who wrote the inspired Proverbs and Song of Solomon and maybe Ecclesiastes. And even there, you've got periods of time where God used him.
Yes.
But the general gift of wisdom, I suppose, was like so many other gifts that God gives people. He doesn't take away your will. You've got to use that gift. And of course, Solomon abused it some of the time.
I think that's the point I wanted to make. God gave him the wisdom, but he had the ability to refute it and to work against it as it benefited him or fulfilled some desire, and he did it. So, if there's a lesson there, there's a lesson there. We need to learn it. Okay.
Where's your dad?
How you been doing?
Sing number 74. I sing the mighty power of God. Do so. I sing the mighty power of God that made the mountains rise, that spread the flowing seas abroad, and built the lofty skies. I sing the wisdom that ordained the sun to rule the day. The moon shines full at his command, and all the stars obey. I sing the goodness of the Lord, who filled the earth with food, who formed the creatures through his word, and then pronounced them good. Lord, how thy wonders are displayed, where'er I turn my eye. If I survey the ground I tread, or gaze
Good evening. Good to see everyone here tonight. Thanks for coming out for a period of Bible study. Good to see Diane back with us from Texas, and Katie's back from Texas. Shirley and Craig are still out of town. They're supposed to arrive back in town tomorrow. Monty and Cindy are not with us tonight. They're still quarantining. Hunter and Morgan are getting married on Saturday. Is that right? Okay. Gospel meet starts this Sunday. Andy's going to have lessons all 3 service periods in here Sunday. So the only classes will be the youngest kids back in the back. Junior high and above will be in the auditorium Sunday. Men, check your mailboxes for the duties during the gospel meet. We've got listed on there. Those are going to be leading prayers, song leaders, and I'm getting ready to put some names down back there for the audio visual too. So if you work the audio visual, check after the services, and I'll be putting those names up. Is there anything else we need to mention tonight? Okay, we'll be closing prayer.
Pray with me, please. Father, as we depart from this place, we pray that you would go with us and help us to maintain our example of your name. And we pray that you would guide us and help us to always be conscious of the responsibilities we have as children of yours, that we would be bold as opportunity is presented to us, and be wise in the words that we use to exercise, to take advantage of those opportunities, to spread your word, to talk about you. And please, Father, help us to always put away from us the things that will cause us to have a bad reputation that reflects on you. Forgive us when we fall short of your name, and help us to be stronger and glorifying as we walk in the world. In Jesus' name we pray.